The Hebrew people weren't meant to live in captivity. We weren't meant to live in captivity. The Israelites weren't meant to stay in the desert. We weren't meant to stay in the desert. We all were meant to live in covenant relationship with our Creator. We were given an invitation to move from captivity to covenant.
Good morning. It is good to see you. My name is Bob. If I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, I hope we get that opportunity soon. We are kind of coming back to a series that we've been in for a long time. We finished Genesis a month ago or so, and then we took a break to talk about Deepen, Gather, Go. Last week we had our annual meeting for the year, which I'm just grateful for all of you that were a part of that and shared stories of the good ways that God is meeting and changing you in the midst of this community. What a joyous time that was. And now today we're moving back into Exodus. And so if you have your Bible with you, I'm going to just invite you right now. You can turn there to Exodus chapter 1, and we'll get into that text here in just a little bit. One of the really, what I would consider privileges of the opportunity to be a pastor over the last 25 years is that I have been able to sit with probably thousands of people and hear their stories. And I've often thought about all the stories that I've heard, and I'm wondering, what would be the common story? What would be the common thread that maybe I could put together and weave together out of all the stories that I've heard? And it's been interesting to think about that because for many, there's, the victories of life are kind of all over the place. And there's no real consistent theme other than that there are high times of life that we celebrate and that we know of. And for some people, it seems that they have a kind of their way of seeing the world. They think of high times a lot. And for others of us, maybe that isn't the case. And we don't see as many high times of life. And we think maybe it's been a bit more on the down. But that down is the place where I would say I have found the common thread of everyone's life. Every story I've ever listened to has at some point hit a place where life doesn't go like we would expect it to go. And there's been pain, and there's been suffering, and there's been grief. There's been injustice, and there's been frustration. There's been loss of job, loss of life, loss of so many things. And what I have found that every story, if we listen long enough, begins to talk about those low places and those moments where we're uncertain how we're ever going to make it out of that particular season. It feels like the walls have kind of pushed in. It feels like darkness surrounds us. It feels like there aren't even options to get better or to get out of whatever it is that we're in. And this is the common thread that I have found in the stories told by hundreds and thousands of people over these years. And I think that is probably not the common theme we wish it were, do we? We wish the story was of those grandeur things, the places of success, and yet in that space of loss and grief and pain, there becomes a narrative that is told throughout the scriptures that this indeed is the human experience. And there are going to be some questions that get asked in our human experience that are going to be common to all of us. The first question that we see is, where are you? Now, this would be a question that would refer to, or we are referring to God in some way. Where are you? Where are you in the middle of this situation? Now, some of us, if you don't have a faith background, maybe you haven't asked that in that way. Maybe you've asked, why in the world am I here? What's going on around me? Why does it feel like I'm alone? This isn't what life's supposed to be about. Maybe your question sounds a little bit different, but for any that have faith, there is a sense that when we hit those low places or the places of grief and pain, the where are you makes sense because there's a cry out of, God, I thought you said that you would be with me. I thought you said that there was nothing I would go through in life where you wouldn't be there. And so this question becomes a question that is asked throughout the scriptures. And if you look at the book of the collection of the Psalms, You will see that question over and over and over. Where are you? I'm not supposed to be alone. But then there's a relational question that comes after that. The question of, don't you care? Not only are you not here, but it doesn't seem like you even give any care about my situation. It doesn't seem like you're even moved to come near me in this place. Isn't it true that when we're in pain, when we're in grief, we don't expect people to fix that situation, but man, it matters if they just care, if they're just with us, if they just come along beside, if they just show that they are there in our presence with us. That care matters so much. And these two questions are what are going to launch us into where we're going to be today as we get into the book of Exodus. Now, but before we get there, I want to just bring us up to date of where we are. Because the book of Exodus is actually, it starts with the word and. Now, if it means and, that means that what comes before is really important. And so the way that this book sits within the scriptures is that Exodus is not to be read by itself, but it must be read in conjunction with what came before it, which is Genesis. And so if you have been around at all over the last number of months, you know that we've taken a lot of time to walk through Genesis and the story from creation all the way through chapter 50, where Joseph shows up. And in the middle of that are the promises of God that he says he is going to form a people. He's going to form a people who the rest of the world is going to know who he is through that group. And he's going to be faithful to them. And the rest of the world is going to come to understand his might and his power and his mercy and his grace and his goodness, all because they live in relationship to him. That was the story. And so we ended Genesis with Joseph, who had been kind of sold into slavery by his brothers into Egypt. And now into Egypt come this family, a family of 70 at the time. And they come into Egypt and they now find space in Goshen to live there, this area of Egypt. And that's where they're going to live. And so what we see in chapter 1, verse 7 of Exodus, this is where I get to use my Bible. And it's going to be on the screen there for you. So it says, when the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, there we go. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. This is what's told about what happens when they're in Egypt, is they multiplied, became tons and tons of people, many, many people, hundreds and thousands of people. And what does that reflect back? It reflects back to the story or to the promise that God had given to the Israelites in Genesis, that I'm going to make you people and I'm going to have you multiply. And that's going to be your mission. This was actually resounding all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2, that this was part of what humanity was to do. They were to multiply and increase. And so the Israelites are doing exactly what God had asked them to do and told them was going to happen, is that they are now in Egypt, but they are increasing and multiplying as a people. But here's what's interesting is when you multiply and increase as a people in the middle of another nation, that nation gets really afraid that you're becoming too many. And this is what's happening in Egypt. The Pharaoh at the time of Joseph's life, where they were friends and Joseph had an ideal setting with him, he has died. Another Pharaoh or another king is taken over. He has no relationship to Joseph, or at least no care about the Israelite people, except that he sees them as a problem. But he's going to try to do two things. He's going to squash them so that they are not a threat to his power, and he is going to use them for his own benefit and make them slaves to increase his economic engine of Egypt. And so these people become a problem, but also a potential benefit to him. But in order for that tenuous balance to be there, he needs to make sure that there's not too many of them. And so he begins a process where he finds three ways to try to squash and limit the number of Israelites that are in this land. So he wants to increase the brutal working conditions that they're under. He forces them to work harder than they've ever worked with less resources. He's then asking the midwives, who are Israelite or Hebrew midwives, to end the baby boy's birth. So whenever an Israelite would be having a baby, he asked the midwives to make sure that if it was a baby boy, that they made sure that that baby died. And then lastly, he put into place the drowning of baby boys in the Nile to make sure that there were less and less threat to him and to the power of Egypt. These three things were what he put in place. So what happens? The first one, the brutal working conditions. He puts these really hard things in place, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. That's really frustrating as a Pharaoh. You try to squash them, you try to make their work hard, you try to make them so physically exhausted that it's impossible for them to continue to multiply, and in fact, it's exactly what happens. More and more and more Israelites keep showing up onto the scene, and your power, which you feel just like moving out of your grasp and out of your hand, it's a significant problem. So he moves to step 2, where the midwives are to end the baby boy's birth. So the midwives, however, they feared God, and they did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. And I love the story of how he's explained. You'll need to go back and read the entirety of Exodus 1 through 4 after today to get the entire story. But part of this is the Pharaoh calls in the 2 midwives of the Hebrews, and he says, hey, there's something going on. I told the 2 of you to make sure that no baby boys survived, but they just keep multiplying. What's going on? And I love their response. It's crazy. I mean, these Israelite women are so hardy and so strong. They're not like the Egyptian women. They just these babies just come before anybody even knows that they're there. I mean, at 1 second, they're like cutting down wheat, and all of a sudden there's a baby in their arms. We don't know how it happens. That's the story that they tell. But these ladies are amazing, and they're just so strong. They didn't even stop what they were doing. The babies come before we could get there. And God hears what happens, and he blesses them. And they have prosperous lives themselves for protecting the children that God has asked them to protect. And it's amazing to me to think of the impact that these midwives have in this story. It's amazing to think that they were looking at the face of fear in the face of the Pharaoh who could destroy them and wipe them out. And they chose in that moment to say, here's what we're going to do because this is what's honoring to God, and we will take any consequence that might come against us. And instead, in God's amazing ways, he blesses them, and they find favor, and God cares for them in this miraculous way. So the last one then is that he said, if those don't work, we're going to just drown all the baby boys in the Nile. But when she could not hide him any longer, this is the story then of Moses. Moses' mother has him, a Hebrew Israelite lady, has this little boy named Moses. His name will be later. He has this little boy. She can't hide him any longer. So she eventually puts him in a papyrus basket, and he coats it with tar and pitch. And then she places the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Now, what we wouldn't catch here in English, but it's a really important theme that's running through here, is this word basket is the same word that if we think all the way back into Genesis story of Noah, it's the same word as ark. So imagine this. You remember what the ark was. The ark was a floating Eden. It was a floating place where God was holding together his creation and protecting them. And they were floating above the flood that was happening in destroying and punishing the evil of the world. But this floating Eden continued. And out of this floating Eden became a people that then continued forward into the journey of God's redemption of the world through eventually Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And now Moses finds himself floating on an ark in the Nile. The very place that was designed for death, according to the Pharaoh, is now the thing that the ark, this Eden space, is now floating upon the chaos and the destruction of the river, and it holds within it the life and the promise of what God is going to do moving forward. It's a remarkable story, a remarkable image of the way that God is going to protect and care for and carry his people along. Now, let's fast forward. We got to tell the story quickly. But Moses is saved. He grows up in the Pharaoh's house. In fact, he's weaned and cared for in the early stages of his life by his own mom because his sister saw him be picked up by the Pharaoh's daughter, and she went in and said, hey, wouldn't it be better if this little baby was cared for by a mother from the Israelites? She said, yeah, that sounds good. So Moses is returned to his mom, and long enough for her to raise him up, just in time for the bad teenage years to send him back into the palace. No, I don't know if it was that long. But they put him back then into the palace. He was raised as an Egyptian with all the privileges and all the resources that would happen for a king's son. And in that space, we don't know a lot about his life or what happens, but we hear that at one point, Moses looks out and realizes that there's a problem, that he sees his own people being taken advantage of. And so in Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, says, during that long period, the king of the Egypt died. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. A couple more important facts is that Moses, while he's there, sees his people being abused. So one day he sees an Egyptian abusing one of his people, goes out and kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand. The next day he goes out and he sees his Hebrew brothers and sisters somewhere, and they say, oh, what are you doing? You're going to kill us too. And he knows that he's been found out, and he leaves. He flees to Midian. Well, he's in Midian, he marries, he has a kid, and it's that part now that we pick up. So during this long period that he's in Midian, he's run away. The king of Egypt died. And as this is happening, the Israelites groaned in their slavery, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. This is that place where that first question that we ask, where are you? And do you care? God is saying, actually, I hear, I see, and I'm responding to the pain that the Israelites are in under the Egyptian rule. And it is no longer that I'm going to remain distant. I am coming near. Now, he was never distant before, but God, in his way of working, it's now time where he is going to move in, and things are about to change. And so Moses is doing his thing, and he's caring for sheep and caring as a shepherd out in the wilderness. And one day when he's out there, he comes upon a bush that's burning, but it's not being consumed. You might know that story. And he comes upon this, and this is where we're going to pick up in chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. He comes close to this bush that's burning but not being consumed. And God says to him, do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. The first thing that God is doing in the midst of this relationship with Moses is he's helping Moses to understand that the God that is calling him is a holy God. He is not like the gods of any of the other peoples. He's not like the God that can be controlled or put into a box. This is a God that stands outside time and space. This is the God who everyone must worship. This is the God who has created all that there is. And when he comes to him, he understands that he is not like this God, but he is accountable to this God. But then he says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And this is a reminder that there's been a story that's been a part of the life that has come before him. There's been a history that this group of people would have known, and they would have understood that God has been faithful throughout history. He has formed a people. He's been faithful to his people. He has provided for his people. He has cared for them in every way, and his promises to them of them multiplying and becoming a mighty nation have been true. And that he can be trusted because not only is he holy and unlike Moses, but he has been faithful to provide for him. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivitites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. In this moment, Moses is invited to consider what for us we also must consider when we find ourselves in those places of feeling like life isn't making sense, feeling like the grief is overwhelming, feeling that we are lost and forgotten and that God is no longer caring for us. There is something in us that can resonate with the Israelites so intimately because we've all been there. Some of us have been there individually. Some of us have been there as a part of a people or a community. We've been in that place where we feel completely forgotten and completely isolated, and that the God that we thought would be by our side isn't there. And God, in the midst of this moment, calls out to Moses and says, I'm going to send you to be the one who is going to go into the midst of this grief-stricken people, the people that are stuck in slavery and think there's no way out. I'm going to send you to proclaim that I'm a holy God, I'm a trustworthy God, I'm a faithful God, I'm a God who has the power to redeem and to care and to restore, to lead into freedom and take you into the land that I've promised you. I am the God that has the power to do that. And we see Moses say to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And this begins an ongoing dialogue over the next chapter and a half that you probably need to go and read at some point, because Moses just keeps battling back with God to say, you've got the wrong guy. I stutter. I don't have it all together. I'm not wise enough. I'm not smart enough. The people aren't going to really look at me and think that I have anything good to offer to them. On and on and on. The excuses flow. You ever been there? You ever heard God say, hey, I want to get your attention and I want to invite you into one of the purposes and plans that I have for you in the midst of the world you're in, and you say, God, it can't be me. It's got to be somebody else that's way more equipped, way better at speaking, way more polished, way more degrees, whatever it might be. We've all been there. When we've heard God move and speak into our worlds, and we think, that couldn't be for me. This is exactly what Moses thinks. So they have some back and forth, but we move down to verse 14. And Moses has said, like, who am I actually supposed to tell them sends me? Because if I just show up unannounced, if I just show up without some kind of backing, no one's really going to care. You ever had somebody come to your house that wants to sell you something? You don't know who they are or why they're there. You don't know what they're bringing or why they think that you have an open door policy for them. And they show up to sell you something or to give you something, and you say, who in the world sent you to me? Now, if you know that your best friend had recommended that you would like something that they had, and they say, oh, actually your friend Sarah sent me because she said that you would want to know about this, it changes everything because of who sent the messenger. That's exactly what Moses is thinking. I need to be sent with some authority. I need to be sent with a name behind me. I need to be sent with something, because if you remember back, he had this kind of encounter with the Israelites before when he'd killed an Egyptian, and then he came to them to kind of take care of another disagreement, and they said, who are you? Are you going to kill us too? It began this recurring statement or recurring relationship that the Israelites have with Moses, where they don't trust necessarily who he is, and we see this played out numerous times in the next number of weeks as we move through this. But we get into this, and God says to Moses, this is verse 14, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. the name you shall call on from generation to generation. God says, Moses, I understand, and I'm going to be really gentle with you. But I want you to be able to tell them that I am sent you. I want you to tell them, and there's a million ways to understand this, right? There's been so much ink spilled of how do we understand I am who I am. And you can read about this in commentaries and theology books, but it seems that the essence of what God is saying to Moses is there is no name greater than the name that I'm sending you in. There is no character of anyone who loves them more than I do. There is no one that knows the story better than I do. There's no one that knows the need that they have like I do. When you go, tell them, I'm the one who's been your protector. I'm the one who's been your provider. I'm the one who has been faithful. I've been the promise keeper. I've been the one to walk with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and all the people in between. I have been faithful to you. So when you tell them who sent you, let them know that the same God who's been faithful for all these years is the same God who's showing up today with you as my mouthpiece. And I'm going to save them out of the despair that they find themselves in. This is the message that God is sending Moses with. Now, the end of chapter 3, all through chapter 4, it's a great story because we can all relate to Moses's not wanting to do this. He irritates God a bit because God said, look, I have told you and I've promised to be with you and I will do this. And Moses just keeps saying, no. And so eventually God gives him a partner, Aaron, to go with him, to be his mouthpiece. I mean, he even tells him, he said, here's what's going to happen is I'm going to give you a staff. You have this staff here, just throw it down. He throws it down, it turns into a snake. He says, now pick it up. He picks it up and turns back into a staff. I mean, that would be cool. I mean, other than it's a snake, I wouldn't like that, but everything else about it's cool. And then he says, then I'll give you another miracle. Like you can take your arm, you can put it inside your cloak and you can pull it out and it'll be leprous. And then you can put it back in your cloak and you can pull it out and it'll be completely healed. Oh, and I'll give you one more. I'll give you the ability to scoop out some water out of the Nile, which was meant to kill you. And when you dump it on the ground, it will turn to blood. I'm going to give you that one too. And Moses still doesn't think that those are enough. Now, we're not going to go further than that because next week we'll hop into some of the plagues and different things that take place there. But there's the words, when Moses hears God say, I am. For those of us today, I want to pause and just kind of interject this because this is a layer for us who now live on this side of the cross, is we begin to hear the reverberations that Jesus is the new Moses. He is the perfect Moses. He is the better Moses. He is the one who came and said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the door. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. And these words of I am, we hear echoed from when God tells us to Moses into what Jesus said about himself. And we begin to see that the Jesus, who we will begin to hear more and more of Moses' story of getting the law and all of that, but Jesus now reconfigures the law. He gives it a new sense of what it is. And the deliverance that Moses would ultimately have the Israelites move out of Egypt, Jesus becomes the ultimate one who restores and takes us out of bondage and slavery to sin into life abundant, where our sin is forgiven and we are restored. And instead of there being offerings of animals, Jesus becomes the offering that is the perfect offering to forgive all people at all time forever. And we begin to hear on this side of the cross the resonance with which Moses is being taught by God that he is to be a faithful, trusting servant of his, because there will be a servant greater than him who will be faithful in all ways to provide the restoration and the healing into the world that it will ultimately need. And this, for you and I today, is the story of the dependence, the grief, the pain that the Israelites found themselves in, which all of us can relate to in one way or another. who now hear the words I am and hear the words of a deliverer who comes to take us out of what we were in into the life that God has promised and provided through Jesus, his son. And the same words, the same questions are asked for many of us today. Where are you, God? And do you really care? Where are you, God? And do you really care? And what you and I get to ask today are those two questions that we have probably been there at one point of life, and maybe it's in the past. Maybe you're reflecting on it, and you say, you know what, I've asked those questions so many times. God, where are you? And do you care about where I am? And if that's you, and you've thought those questions, and you've heard that ringing in your ears, I want you to just think back and remember, what did God do? How was he faithful? How did he move? How did he take you from where you were in that space and move you through to a new place where there was new hope and it was restored and new possibilities emerged? How did he move you from the grave to life? How did he move you from slavery and bondage to freedom and life? How did that happen for you? And you might need to take some moments and just thank him for being faithful again, for doing that. Because every time we're in that space where we ask, where are you and do you care? And we're led out of that into a new place with a new hope and a restored belief that God is with us. It gives us more strength for the next time we find ourselves in that place of asking, God, where are you and do you care? But what I also know is that some of you, that's not a distant place. It's the place you're in today. You are in a place where you feel like no one that's even sitting around you has any idea the depth of pain, grief, question, frustration, hurt, anger that you're in. And if you're totally honest, you're sitting in that place. You walked into one of our places this morning and you thought, I don't even know where God's at on the map. And I don't know if he even cares about where I'm at. The story of Moses births something in us. It encourages us and it tells us that there is a God who has been faithful in the past, and past is really important. It's really important that we remember who God has been, because if we remember who God has been, because he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that he does not change, and if he's been faithful to people in the past, no matter the situation that I'm in today and how short my vision might be, my inability to even see there being any light in the darkness, I lean on what God has been, believing that he will eventually show up, that he indeed will be with me, and that he does care for me. And we're going to close our services here in just a little bit, and I want to just put this invitation out. If you're in one of those spaces today, if you're one of those places where you feel like you are at the bottom, life is really hard. There's been painful loss in your life. You're not sure how you're going to get to tomorrow, much less next week. You've been crying out and crying out and crying out, and it feels like your prayers are just hitting the ceiling. It feels like God is not with you. It feels like he doesn't care about you, and you feel all alone. I want you to know today that there are people that as the service ends who want to pray with you, and they want to carry that with you. They want to encourage you and not guilt you to say, you know what, you shouldn't be saying that, and you shouldn't be asking those questions, because here's the beauty of this, is that God knows fully when we hit that time and that space. And he invites us to scream out in pain, to plead with him, to call on his name, to come near us when we feel like he's been away. Sometimes I've heard people say, well, I should never question, and I never should ask why. God invites our whys. He encourages our whys. He encourages the frustration, the grief, and the anger, because it's in that place where our heart begins to be opened up that if God is truly there, we have an expectancy that he might show up and surprise us. We don't have time. We'll go through the next number of weeks of what happens in the life of Moses, but this sets the stage of God's faithful encounter with his people again. And this is the stage of what Jesus has said he came to do, is to come near the brokenhearted and to be with those who feel like they're on the margins, who are lost, who feel like they are oppressed and who are suffering. Because the heart of God is to come near those who feel broken. And so I want to ask that if we end the time together, as we sing another song in both of our venues, that as we end, you might have a sense inside of you that there is a God who hears your cry, who is responding even now and coming near, and you can trust that because he has been faithful to do that in the past. And there are a group of people who would love to pray over you and with you, to lift you again to the heart of God and say, oh God, come in the middle of our need and restore us to health. Oh God, we thank you. We thank you for the story of Moses. We thank you for the ways that you met him. We thank you for the ways that in the Israelites' cry to you, you heard them and you moved toward them. Thank you for reminding us, God, that our dependence is upon you, the great I am, the one who is perfect in character and perfect in caring, perfect in providing. Oh God, we recognize the times, the places, and the spaces where we feel we're underwater. And we need you to come alongside. We need you to lift our heads. We need you to lift our eyes, to see that our hope comes from you and that you do care and that you are present. So God, I pray for my brothers and sisters across all of the meeting house. May we praise you for bringing us out of the dark times, and may we plead with you if we are there now. We trust you and we give you thanks. Amen.